Appalachia's deadliest granny. She killed 21 federal agents who caged her grandson like animal. The most devastating campaign of vengeance ever waged against the federal government by a single person, and the most terrifying proof that a grandmother's love could transform into violence that no badge could survive. When federal agents caged her grandson in conditions that would have shamed a medieval dungeon, a 71-year-old mountain woman declared war on the United States government and won. This is the true story of Granny Combs, the deadliest woman in Appalachian history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Letcher County, Kentucky, in the heart of the eastern coalfields. During the turbulent years of the late 1920s, when Prohibition had transformed the mountains into a battlefield between federal agents and the families who had been making whiskey since before America was a nation. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since the first settlers crossed the Cumberland Gap, who had never accepted that distant governments had any authority over traditions that predated the Constitution itself. You see, in Letcher County during the years of our story, the making of whiskey was not merely an economic activity, but was a cultural inheritance passed down through generations. The Scots-Irish who had settled these mountains had brought with them knowledge of distillation that reached back centuries, had practiced their craft in the old country, and had continued it in the new without any thought that governments might object. The corn they grew became the whiskey they drank and traded, a transformation as natural to them as the changing of seasons or the rising of the sun. But the 18th Amendment had changed everything. What had been tradition was now crime. What had been heritage was now felony. What had been the right of free men was now the excuse for federal agents to invade hollows that had never before felt government intrusion. The Prohibition Bureau sent its agents into the mountains with warrants and weapons, with quotas to meet and careers to build, with no understanding of the culture they were attacking and no interest in learning. The woman at the center of our story was known throughout the Kentucky mountains as Granny Combs, though her given name was Delilah May Combs, and she had been born Delilah May Fugate in 1858 in a cabin on the upper reaches of Rockhouse Creek. She had married Jeremiah Combs when she was 15, had borne him 14 children of whom 10 survived to adulthood, had buried her husband in 1920, when the pneumonia that had weakened him through years of mine work finally claimed his life. She had continued alone on the mountain where Combses had lived for 5 generations, maintaining traditions that the outside world was now determined to destroy. That's right. Delilah Combs was 71 years old in the autumn of 1929, a woman whose appearance reflected every year of a life that had been harder than most modern Americans could imagine. She stood barely 5 feet tall, weighed perhaps 90 pounds with her boots on, had white hair that she kept pulled back in a severe bun, and hands that were gnarled from 7 decades of mountain labor. Her face was weathered and lined like the bark of an ancient oak, her back slightly bent from years of work that would have broken younger women, her eyes sharp and dark and missing nothing that happened within her domain. But Granny Combs was not the frail, elderly woman that her appearance might have suggested to outsiders, unfamiliar with the capabilities that mountain life could produce. She had spent her entire life performing labor that would have defeated many men, had developed strength that her small frame concealed, had acquired skills in the old ways that most of the modern world had forgotten existed. She still made her own whiskey in a still that her grandfather had built, still tended her own land and raised her own food, still lived according to rhythms that had governed mountain life for 2 centuries. The household that Granny maintained in 1929 was small compared to what it had once been. Most of her children had scattered to cities and coal camps throughout the region, seeking opportunities that the dying traditional economy could no longer provide. Only her youngest daughter, Sarah, had remained nearby, and Sarah had died of tuberculosis in 1927, leaving behind a 7-year-old son named Homer, who had become Granny's responsibility and her reason for continuing to live. Homer was everything to the old woman. He was the last of her direct line, the final connection to the family she had built over 50 years, the child whose laughter filled a cabin that had grown too quiet as the years passed. She had raised him from infancy when Sarah's health had failed, had taught him the old ways, just as she had taught his mother and her mother before her, had poured into him all the love and knowledge that she possessed. The boy was bright and curious, asked questions about everything, showed aptitude for the mountain skills that Granny considered essential. He could track game through forests that others found impenetrable, could identify every plant that grew on the mountain and knew which ones healed and which ones harmed, could help with the still in ways that showed he understood the craft that his ancestors had practiced for generations. He was 9 years old in the autumn of 1929, and he was the center of his great-grandmother's world. The trouble that would transform Granny Combs from mountain matriarch to mass murderer began with the arrival of a federal agent named Vernon Crawford, whose assignment to Letcher County would ultimately cost the lives of 21 men and would create a legend that the mountains still remember. Crawford was not like the other Prohibition agents who had operated in eastern Kentucky. Most of them had been content to make occasional raids, to destroy stills and confiscate whiskey, and arrest whoever happened to be present when they arrived. They understood, even if they did not admit it publicly, that Prohibition was unpopular and that aggressive enforcement only created enemies. They did their jobs without enthusiasm and moved on to other assignments as quickly as they could arrange transfers. Crawford was different. He was a true believer, a man whose hatred of alcohol was personal and intense, whose mission to enforce Prohibition had become a crusade that defined his entire existence. His father had been a drunkard whose violence had scarred Crawford's childhood, and the agent had transferred that hatred to everyone who made or consumed or tolerated the substance he blamed for his suffering. He did not merely want to enforce the law, he wanted to punish those who violated it, wanted them to suffer as he believed his family had suffered. Crawford arrived in Letcher County in the summer of 1929 with a mandate to increase enforcement and with the authority to pursue that mandate however he saw fit. He assembled a team of agents who shared his zeal or who were willing to follow orders without question, men whose methods would eventually shock even their superiors, but whose results initially earned them praise. The first raids under Crawford's command were brutal in ways that previous enforcement had not been. Stills were not merely destroyed, but were demolished with an enthusiasm that suggested personal hatred. Families were not merely arrested, but were humiliated, their homes searched with deliberate destruction, their possessions confiscated under any pretext available. The message was clear. Crawford intended to break the mountain people's resistance through any means necessary. Granny Combs first attracted Crawford's attention through informants who reported that she was still operating a still despite her age, that she was teaching her great-grandson the craft, that she represented exactly the kind of generational transmission of illegal knowledge that Crawford believed must be stopped. The information came from people who should have known better than to betray a mountain family, whose betrayal would eventually cost them dearly. The raid on the Combs property came on the morning of October 15, 1929. Just as the stock market crash was beginning to shake the nation's confidence in everything it had believed, Crawford led the operation personally, brought 20 agents to ensure overwhelming force, approached the property with the confidence of a man who believed his authority was absolute and his cause was righteous. What Crawford found was an elderly woman and a 9-year-old boy, neither of whom offered any resistance that could justify the force he had assembled. The still was where the informants had said it would be, small and old, and producing whiskey in quantities that could not possibly have threatened anyone. Granny watched in silence as the agents destroyed equipment that her grandfather had built, that had been in her family for more than a century, that represented a connection to ancestors whose traditions she had tried to maintain. The destruction alone would not have produced what followed. Mountain people had learned to accept such losses, had rebuilt stills that were destroyed, and continued their traditions despite government interference. What transformed Granny Combs into a killer was not the destruction of property, but what Crawford did to Homer. The agent had decided that the boy's presence at the still, his obvious familiarity with its operation, constituted evidence of criminal activity that must be punished. Federal law provided for harsh penalties against those who involved minors in the liquor trade, and Crawford intended to apply those penalties with maximum force. He announced that Homer would be taken into federal custody, would be placed in a reformatory where he would be separated from the grandmother whose influence had corrupted him. Granny's protests were ignored. Her explanations that Homer was just a child, that he had done nothing except help his great-grandmother as children, had helped their elders since time began, fell on ears that had no interest in hearing them. Crawford had found an opportunity to make an example that would be discussed throughout the mountains, and he was not going to let an old woman's tears prevent him from seizing it. Homer was taken that morning, dragged from his great-grandmother's arms by agents who showed no more concern for his terror than they would have shown for a captured animal. The boy screamed for Granny as they put him in the vehicle that would transport him away from everything he had ever known, screamed until his voice gave out, and his screams became silent sobs that shook his small body. Granny tried to follow, tried to reach the vehicle where her great-grandson was imprisoned, but agents held her back with force that was unnecessary against a 71-year-old woman, but that they applied anyway. Crawford himself told her that she would never see the boy again, that Homer would be placed in a federal facility where mountain corruption could not reach him, that the cycle of illegal behavior that had defined her family for generations would finally be broken. The facility where Homer was sent was a federal reformatory in Ohio, an institution that housed juvenile offenders from throughout the region and that was chronically overcrowded and understaffed. The conditions there were brutal even by the standards of the era, the young inmates subjected to discipline that bordered on torture and living conditions that would have been illegal in any legitimate prison. But Homer's experience was worse than what other inmates endured, because Crawford had made special arrangements to ensure that the boy's punishment would be exemplary. The agent had contacts at the reformatory, officials who shared his beliefs about the necessity of harsh treatment for those who had been raised in criminal environments. These contacts ensured that Homer was placed in the facility's most restrictive unit, subjected to discipline that exceeded even the institution's brutal norms. The boy was kept in a cage, not a cell, not a room, but an actual cage, a structure of iron bars that measured 6 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet, too small to stand upright in, and too short to lie down fully extended. The cage was in a basement room that received no natural light, that was cold in winter and stifling in summer, that was cleaned only when the smell became too offensive for the guards to tolerate. Homer lived in this cage for 9 months. He was fed through the bars like an animal, was given water in a bowl that he had to lap from because no cup was provided, was allowed out only for brief periods of exercise that consisted of walking in circles in a concrete yard while guards watched with weapons ready. He was beaten when he cried, beaten when he asked for his grandmother, beaten when he did anything that the guards found annoying or inconvenient. The isolation was as devastating as the physical abuse. Homer had never been separated from family for more than a few hours in his entire life, had grown up surrounded by people who loved him, had known security that most children take for granted until it is gone. Now he was alone in darkness that seemed to have no end, surrounded by sounds of other children suffering, unable to understand what he had done to deserve punishment so extreme. The other inmates learned to avoid the basement where Homer was kept, knew that the guards considered him a special project, understood that association with him would bring attention that no one wanted. He had no companions in his suffering, no one to share the endless hours of darkness, no voice except his own and the echoes that the walls returned to him. The guards took particular pleasure in describing what would happen to Granny, told Homer that she had been arrested, that she had died, that she had forgotten about him. They invented torments specifically designed to break whatever hope remained in a 9-year-old who had already lost everything else. They competed with each other to find new ways to make him cry, new methods of inflicting psychological damage that would leave no visible marks. By the 3rd month, Homer had stopped speaking entirely. By the 4th month, he had stopped eating unless forced. By the 5th month, the guards began to worry that he might die and that his death would create problems they did not want to face. They reduced the worst of the abuse, though they did not improve the conditions, did not release him from the cage, did not provide any of the care that a child his age required. The experience broke something in the boy that would never be fully repaired. The child who had laughed and asked questions and shown aptitude for the old ways became a silent creature whose eyes held nothing but fear, whose body flinched at any sudden movement, whose soul had retreated to somewhere that the abuse could not reach, but from which it could not fully return. Granny learned about the conditions of Homer's imprisonment through sources that Crawford had not anticipated. The mountain network of kinship and obligation extended further than any federal agent understood, reached into institutions that seemed immune to outside influence, connected people whose relationships were invisible to official eyes. A guard at the reformatory who had relatives in the Kentucky mountains, who had been raised with values that he had suppressed but not destroyed, could not continue watching what was being done to the Combs boy. He sent word through channels that the federal authorities did not know existed, described conditions that even hardened mountain people found shocking, provided details that would haunt Granny for the rest of her life. The letter reached Granny in January of 1930, 3 months after Homer had been taken. She read it in the cabin where she had raised 4 generations of children, read the words by the light of a lamp that had illuminated so many peaceful evenings. She read about the cage and the beatings and the darkness, read about her great-grandson being treated in ways that she would not have treated the meanest animal on her property. The letter described dimensions, 6 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet. It described schedules, 1 meal a day, exercise twice a week if the guards remembered. It described punishments, beatings with wooden paddles for infractions that included crying, speaking without permission, or failing to eat food that was deliberately made unpalatable. It described a child who had given up hope, who no longer responded to his name, who had become something less than human because treating him as human had become too painful. Something changed in Delilah Combs that day, something fundamental that would not change back until 21 men were dead. The grandmother who had spent 71 years building family, nurturing children, creating life, became something else entirely. The love that had defined her existence transformed into something darker and more purposeful, a force that would prove more devastating than any weapon the federal government possessed. She did not react immediately. The rage that filled her was cold rather than hot, patient rather than impulsive, calculating in ways that would prove devastating to those it was directed against. She understood that any direct action against federal authorities would result in her own imprisonment, would leave Homer without anyone to advocate for his release, would accomplish nothing except her own destruction. The cold rage was different from anything Granny had experienced in her 71 years. It did not dissipate with time, did not fade as the shock of the letter wore off, did not transform into acceptance or resignation as grief usually did. Instead, it hardened into something permanent, a foundation upon which she would build the campaign that would consume the next 2 years of her life. Instead, Granny began to plan. She used the Mountain Network to gather information about Vernon Crawford and the agents who worked under him, learned their names and faces and routines, identified their vulnerabilities and their patterns. She discovered that Crawford had a wife and children in a town 50 miles away, that he visited them on weekends when his duties permitted, that his dedication to destroying mountain families did not prevent him from maintaining one of his own. The network provided information that no federal investigation could have obtained. People who had reason to hate the Prohibition Bureau were everywhere, in post offices and telegraph stations and boarding houses, in every place where agents conducted their business. They watched and listened and remembered, and when Granny's inquiries reached them through channels they recognized, they shared what they knew without hesitation or fear. She learned about each of the agents who had participated in the raid on her property, who had held her back while Homer was dragged away, who had followed Crawford's orders without question or conscience. She compiled a list of 21 names, memorized their faces from photographs that the network provided, studied them with the same attention she had once given to learning which plants healed and which plants killed. She learned their histories and their habits, their strengths and their weaknesses. She discovered which ones were married and which ones drank, and which ones kept mistresses that their wives did not know about. She mapped their lives with the patience of a hunter studying prey, identified the moments when each would be most vulnerable, planned approaches that would leave no opportunity for escape or resistance, and she waited. She waited while lawyers she could not afford tried to challenge Homer's imprisonment through courts that showed no interest in the welfare of a mountain boy. The lawyers took her money and filed papers that were rejected, made appeals that were denied, pursued remedies that existed only on paper and never in practice. The legal system was not designed to protect children like Homer from abuses committed in its name. She waited while appeals were denied and petitions were ignored, and every legal avenue was systematically closed. She visited the courthouse in the county seat, a small woman in worn clothes who attracted no attention from officials who saw dozens like her every week. She read the decisions that dismissed her claims, understood the words that explained why a grandmother had no right to challenge the treatment of her great-grandson, learned that the law was not her ally. She waited while Homer suffered in his cage, while the months accumulated and her great-grandson's childhood was stolen one day at a time. Each night, she looked at the empty bed where Homer had slept, remembered the sound of his laughter that had filled this cabin, imagined what was being done to him in that darkness she could not reach. The waiting was its own form of torture, but she endured it because she knew that patience was the weapon that would prove most devastating. The waiting ended in July of 1930, when Homer was finally released after 9 months of imprisonment that had transformed him from a bright, curious child into a broken ghost. The release came not through any legal victory, but through administrative changes at the reformatory. New officials who found the conditions in the basement unit too extreme, even by the standards of the institution. The boy who returned to Granny's cabin was not the boy who had been taken. He arrived in clothes that did not fit, clothes that had been worn by other inmates before him, clothes that smelled of the institution and its misery. A guard who seemed eager to be rid of his charge delivered him like a package rather than a person, handed Granny papers to sign without meeting her eyes, departed before she could ask any questions about what had been done to her great-grandson. Homer showed no recognition of the home he had loved, did not respond to Granny's voice or her touch, seemed to exist in a world that had no connection to the one around him. His eyes were open but saw nothing, or perhaps saw things that no one else could see, things that he would never be able to describe because he would never again speak easily. He did not speak for 3 months after his release. He flinched when Granny tried to touch him, cowered in corners when anyone approached, wet himself when voices were raised or movements were sudden. At night he screamed in sleep, terrible sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his small body should have been able to produce, sounds that Granny heard even when she covered her ears. Granny cared for him with patience that exceeded anything she had known she possessed. She learned to approach him slowly, to speak in tones that never varied, to touch him only when absolutely necessary and only with warning. She fed him foods he had loved before his imprisonment, prepared them exactly as she had always prepared them, hoped that taste and smell might reach parts of him that words could not. But she understood that patience alone could not heal what had been done. The damage was too deep, too fundamental, too deliberately inflicted to be repaired through love alone. Homer would carry the scars of his imprisonment for the rest of his life, would never fully become the person he should have been, would always bear the marks of what federal agents had done to a 9-year-old boy whose only crime had been loving his grandmother. The campaign of vengeance began on September 15, 1930, exactly 11 months after Homer had been taken. Granny had spent those months preparing, had refined her plans and gathered her resources, and waited for the moment when she could begin without immediately drawing suspicion toward herself. The moment arrived when Crawford and his agents conducted another raid in the county, their attention focused on targets that had nothing to do with the Combs family. The first victim was not Crawford himself, but was one of the agents who had been present at the raid, a man named Dale Tackett, who had been the one to physically drag Homer from Granny's arms. Tackett had transferred to a different district after the Combs raid, had believed himself beyond any consequence of what he had done, was living in a small town in Virginia, where he continued his career without any thought of the enemies he had made. Granny found him through the network, traveled to Virginia by means that left no record of her journey, located him in the boarding house where he was staying while on assignment. She was 71 years old, stood barely 5 feet tall, weighed less than 100 pounds, and she killed Dale Tackett with her bare hands in a confrontation that left the agent's body in condition that shocked the investigators who found it. The killing was not quick. Granny had decided that the men who had caged her grandson deserved to experience something of what Homer had experienced, something of the fear and the helplessness and the pain that went on far longer than seemed possible. She kept Tackett alive for hours, working on him with tools and techniques that she had learned through a lifetime of processing animals for food, applying those skills to purposes they had never been intended for. When she was finished, When Tackett's body had been reduced to something that barely resembled what it had been, she disappeared into the night and made her way back to Kentucky through routes that no investigator would ever trace. The body was found 2 days later, the condition producing horror that would be discussed for years among those who knew about it. The investigation focused on the many criminals that Tackett had arrested during his career, on the moonshiners and bootleggers who might have sought revenge for his enforcement actions. No one suspected an elderly woman from Kentucky, a grandmother whose great-grandson had been released from custody months before, and whose case had been closed. The connection that would eventually become obvious was invisible at first, hidden by assumptions about what women of her age were capable of. The second killing came 3 weeks later, claiming Robert Lawson, another agent who had participated in the Combs raid. Lawson was found in circumstances similar to Tackett's, his body displaying the same evidence of prolonged torture, the same signs of expertise that suggested the killer knew exactly what they were doing. The connection between the two deaths was recognized immediately, the pattern suggesting a single perpetrator with a specific agenda. That's right. Granny continued her campaign through the autumn and winter of 1930-31, taking her victims with a regularity that demonstrated her patience and her skill. The third killing came in November, the fourth in December, each following patterns that the investigators could recognize but could not predict. The fear that spread through the Prohibition Bureau was unlike anything the agency had experienced. Agents who had worked in eastern Kentucky were dying one by one, killed in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of their habits and their vulnerabilities, murdered by someone whose identity no investigation could determine. Some agents requested transfers, hoping that distance would provide safety. Others resigned from the Bureau entirely, deciding that no career was worth the risk of dying as their colleagues had died. A few demanded increased security, but the Bureau's resources were limited, and the protection that could be provided was inadequate against a killer who seemed capable of reaching anyone, anywhere. The 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th killings came in rapid succession during the spring of 1931, Granny's pace accelerating as the remaining agents' fear made them careless. Men who were afraid made mistakes, provided opportunities that a patient hunter could exploit, revealed vulnerabilities that they would have concealed in calmer times. The 9th killing was significant because it claimed the assistant warden of the reformatory where Homer had been imprisoned, a man whose direct responsibility for the conditions of Homer's confinement made him a target that Granny had prioritized from the beginning. This victim was found in Ohio, far from Kentucky, demonstrating that the killer's reach extended well beyond the mountains. The reformatory official had been responsible for placing Homer in the cage, had personally approved the discipline that had included beatings for crying. His death was the most prolonged of any Granny had yet performed, lasted nearly 3 days in a location so isolated that no one heard his screams. When the body was found, the condition exceeded anything the previous killings had prepared investigators for. The 10th through 15th killings cleared most of the agents who had participated in the original raid, each death adding to a toll that had begun to seem inevitable. Crawford himself had gone into hiding by this point, had requested protection that the Bureau struggled to provide, had surrounded himself with guards whose presence could not guarantee his safety against a killer who had demonstrated the ability to reach anyone. The Bureau brought in its best investigators, deployed resources that exceeded anything previously committed to catching a single perpetrator, developed profiles and theories and strategies that all proved inadequate. The killer was described as probably male, probably young, probably possessing military or law enforcement training. Every assumption was wrong. The 16th and 17th killings claimed agents who had been placed under protective custody, men whose locations were supposed to be secret, but whose security could not withstand a hunter who had been stalking game in these mountains since before their fathers were born. The message was clear: no protection could save those on Granny's list, no distance could place them beyond her reach. The 18th and 19th killings occurred in states far from Kentucky, claiming agents who had transferred to California and Florida in hopes of escaping whatever was hunting them. Granny's network extended further than anyone had imagined, connected to people in places that had no obvious connection to the Kentucky mountains, but that were linked through the invisible bonds of kinship and obligation that the mountain people maintained. By the summer of 1932, nearly 2 years after the campaign had begun, only Crawford himself and one other agent remained alive from the 21 who had participated in the Combs raid. The bureau chief, who had supported Crawford's aggressive tactics, had been forced to resign in the face of losses that could not be explained or prevented. The entire approach to prohibition enforcement in the mountain regions had been reconsidered, the aggressive raids replaced by more cautious approaches that were unlikely to create the kind of enemies who were willing to kill. Crawford was living in what amounted to a fortress, a federal facility that had been converted into a safe house specifically for his protection. He was surrounded by guards around the clock, was never left alone, was observed and protected in ways that should have made any attack impossible. He had become a prisoner himself, caged by the fear of a killer whose identity he still did not know, but whose purpose he had begun to understand. The connection between the killings and the Combs case had finally been recognized. Investigators had reviewed Crawford's enforcement history, had identified the pattern that linked every victim to a single raid, had concluded that someone connected to the Combs family was responsible for the deaths. But the suspect they imagined was not an elderly woman. They were searching for a man, probably one of Granny's sons or grandsons, someone with the strength and mobility that such a campaign would seem to require. They were not searching for Granny herself. The idea that a 72-year-old woman could have killed 19 federal agents, could have traveled to multiple states, could have overpowered men who were younger and stronger and armed, was too absurd for serious consideration. She was questioned, of course, was asked about the whereabouts of her male relatives, was watched for signs that she might lead investigators to the real killer. But she was never suspected of being that killer herself. The trap that Granny prepared for Crawford was her masterpiece, the culmination of everything she had learned during 2 years of killing. She had identified a weakness in his protection, a moment when his guard would be reduced, an opportunity that required patience and precision, but that would finally bring her face to face with the man who had ordered her grandson caged like an animal. Crawford's wife was dying. Cancer had been diagnosed 6 months earlier, and the disease had progressed to the point where doctors said she had only weeks to live. The agent had been unable to visit her, had been trapped in his safe house while his wife died in a hospital 50 miles away, had been forced to choose between his safety and his family, just as he had forced Granny to watch her family be taken from her. When his wife's death became imminent, Crawford made a decision that would prove fatal. He would go to her, would spend her final hours at her bedside regardless of the risk, would not let the fear of death prevent him from being present when the woman he loved departed the world. His guards argued against it. His superiors warned him that leaving the safe house was suicide, but Crawford was determined. The journey was supposed to be secret. The route was planned to avoid any location where the killer might anticipate his presence. The security was the most comprehensive that had ever been provided for a single federal agent, and none of it mattered against a hunter who had been tracking Crawford for 2 years and who knew more about his movements than his own protectors did. Granny intercepted the convoy on a mountain road that Crawford's security team had believed was safe, that their intelligence had told them was free of any threat. She did not attack alone. The network had provided assistance for this final operation, men whose debts to the Combs family demanded repayment and who were willing to risk everything to help Granny complete her campaign. The ambush was over in minutes. The security team was eliminated by coordinated fire from positions they had not known were occupied, by shooters whose marksmanship exceeded anything federal training could match. When the shooting stopped, only Crawford remained alive, surrounded by the bodies of men who had died trying to protect him. Granny emerged from the forest to confront the man she had been hunting for 2 years. Crawford saw a small elderly woman approaching with a calm that seemed impossible, given what had just occurred, whose eyes held a hatred so cold that it seemed to drop the temperature of the air around her. "Do you remember Homer Combs?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the silence that had followed the gunfire. "Do you remember a 9-year-old boy you took from his great-grandmother and put in a cage?" Crawford remembered. The memory had been with him every day since the killings began, since he had understood that his aggressive enforcement had created an enemy whose determination exceeded anything he had imagined. He had tried to justify what he had done, had told himself that the boy's treatment was not his responsibility, had attempted to transfer the guilt to others. But standing here, facing the woman whose family he had destroyed, he could not escape the truth of what he had done. "He was a criminal," Crawford said, the defense sounding hollow even to his own ears. "He was being raised as a criminal. I was trying to break the cycle, trying to save him from becoming what his family had always been." "He was 9 years old," Mahata Granny replied. "He was a child who helped his great-grandmother, because that's what children do. You put him in a cage, you let them beat him when he cried for me, you broke him so badly that he still won't speak, still won't let anyone touch him, still screams every night from dreams he can never escape. You did that to a 9-year-old boy and you called it saving him." "I didn't know," Crawford said. "I didn't know about the cage, about the beatings. I just wanted—" "You knew enough," Granny interrupted. "You knew you were sending a child to a place where children were broken. You knew because breaking them was the point. You wanted to make an example, and you made one. Now I'm going to make one too." The death of Vernon Crawford was the most prolonged and elaborate of all the killings Granny had performed. She had 2 years of accumulated grief and rage to express, 2 years of watching her great-grandson suffer from wounds that would never fully heal, 2 years of hatred that now found its ultimate outlet. She made Crawford experience something of what Homer had experienced. She confined him in a space too small to stand or lie down, kept him there for days while she visited periodically to inflict the kind of pain that Homer had endured. She fed him through bars like an animal, gave him water in a bowl he had to lap from, beat him when he cried or begged or did anything that she found annoying. The process lasted for a week. Granny had prepared a location where the work could proceed without interference, where Crawford's screams would reach no one who might help him. She took her time, ensured that he understood exactly why he was suffering, made certain that his final days were filled with the fear and helplessness that he had inflicted on a child. When Crawford finally died, after a week of suffering that exceeded anything his victims had endured, Granny felt something shift inside her that she had not expected. The rage that had sustained her for 2 years began to fade, replaced by an exhaustion that went deeper than physical tiredness. She had done what she had set out to do, had killed 21 men who had contributed to her grandson's destruction, had proven that mountain justice still had power even against the federal government. But Homer was still broken. The killings could not undo what had been done to him, could not restore the bright and curious child who had been taken from her, could not heal wounds that had been inflicted too deeply to ever fully close. The vengeance was complete, but the loss remained. The final victim, the 21st, was the informant who had told Crawford about Granny's still, whose betrayal had started everything that followed. This man had believed himself safe because his role had been concealed, because he had never participated in any of the events that followed his initial betrayal. He was wrong. Granny found him 3 weeks after Crawford's death, visited him in the night as she had visited so many others, administered the justice that mountain culture reserved for those who betrayed their neighbors to outside authorities. His death was quick compared to Crawford's, a mercy that Granny granted not from compassion, but from exhaustion. The campaign was over and she had no energy left for elaborate punishment. 21 men. Vernon Crawford and 20 others who had participated in the raid on the Combs property or who had contributed to Homer's imprisonment and abuse. All of them dead now, all of them having experienced the kind of death that Granny believed they deserved, all of them beyond the reach of any justice except the justice she had already provided. The investigation continued for years after the final killing. The case never officially closed, but never solved. The Bureau eventually concluded that a network of mountain moonshiners had been responsible for the killings, that the attacks represented coordinated resistance to prohibition enforcement, rather than the work of a single individual. The possibility that an elderly woman had been personally responsible for all 21 deaths was considered briefly and dismissed as impossible. Granny Combs lived for another 15 years after completing her campaign, dying in 1947 at the age of 89. She spent those years caring for Homer, who gradually improved but who never fully recovered from what had been done to him. The boy eventually grew into a man who could function in the world, could work and provide for himself, but who remained marked by an experience that had stolen his childhood and much of his capacity for joy. The years after the campaign were quieter than any Granny had known since Homer's imprisonment. She returned to the rhythms of mountain life, tended her garden and her animals, maintained the traditions that the federal government had tried to destroy. She did not resume making whiskey, had no interest in activities that might attract the attention that her campaign had made dangerous. The still that her grandfather had built remained unused, a monument to a time that had passed. Homer's improvement was slow and incomplete. He began speaking again after 6 months, single words at first, and then simple sentences, his voice soft and hesitant and easily silenced by any sign of disapproval. He learned to tolerate Granny's touch, though he never sought it, never initiated contact that would have been natural between a child and his grandmother. The nightmares continued for years, gradually decreasing in frequency, but never entirely disappearing. By the time Homer was a teenager, he had developed coping mechanisms that allowed him to function in limited ways. He could perform simple tasks if given clear instructions, could interact with people he knew well if they were careful not to startle him, could live a life that was constricted but possible. He never attended school, never formed friendships, never experienced the normal social development that his early years had promised. Granny became protective of him in ways that bordered on isolation, shielding him from a world that she believed had already done enough damage. Visitors to the Combs property were rare and carefully managed, their presence announced well in advance so that Homer could prepare himself. The mountain network that had helped Granny during her campaign now helped protect Homer, warning of any approach that might disturb the fragile peace they had constructed. She never spoke of what she had done, never confessed to anyone who might have recorded her confession, took her secrets to the grave where she was buried beside her husband in the Combs family cemetery. The killings became legend in the mountains, attributed to various explanations that never included an elderly grandmother, told as cautionary tales about the consequences of government overreach without any awareness of the specific truth. The truth emerged only decades later, when papers were found among her possessions that documented every killing in detail. The papers had been hidden in a metal box beneath the floorboards of her cabin, preserved by the mountain air that had kept so many documents from earlier generations, discovered by descendants who were renovating the property for modern use. The papers had been written in a careful hand that showed no regret, recorded facts without commentary, created a document that read more like a ledger than a confession. Each killing was numbered, each victim was identified by name and role, each death was described with enough detail to leave no doubt about what had occurred. She had kept records not from pride, but from a need to ensure that Homer's suffering had been properly avenged, that no one who had contributed to his torture had escaped the justice she had determined they deserved. The discovery produced shock that rippled through the family and eventually through the academic community that studied Appalachian history. The documents were authenticated by handwriting experts. The details were verified through federal records that confirmed the deaths of the 21 agents. The story was reconstructed from evidence that left no room for doubt about what had occurred. The descendants who found the papers debated what to do with them for years before eventually sharing them with historians who studied Prohibition-era violence. The story was published in academic journals and eventually in popular accounts, becoming part of the region's documented history rather than merely a legend passed down through generations. The historians who examined the case found it remarkable not only for the scale of Granny's campaign, but for its complete success. She had killed 21 federal agents over a period of 2 years without ever being identified as a suspect, had evaded the largest manhunt in Bureau history, had lived another 15 years without any consequence for her actions. The combination of mountain skills, network support, and sheer determination had proven more than a match for federal law enforcement. The legal scholars who analyzed the case debated whether Granny could have been prosecuted if she had been identified while still alive. The evidence against her would have been overwhelming, but any trial would have required revealing the conditions under which Homer had been imprisoned, would have exposed the systematic abuse that federal institutions had inflicted on a child. The government might have chosen not to prosecute rather than face such revelations. The psychological analysis has examined both Granny's capacity for violence and the trauma that Homer experienced. The abuse inflicted on a 9-year-old boy, the deliberate destruction of his childhood in a cage that no civilized society should have tolerated, represented a failure of governmental responsibility that went far beyond any individual agent's cruelty. The system that was supposed to rehabilitate juvenile offenders had instead broken a child who had done nothing except help his elderly grandmother. Some scholars have focused on the reformatory itself, examining records that revealed patterns of abuse extending far beyond Homer's case. The facility had been investigated and eventually closed in the 1940s, its practices deemed unacceptable, even by the standards of an era that tolerated much harsher treatment of children than modern society would accept. Homer was not the only child who had been caged and beaten, only the one whose grandmother had been capable of revenge. Others have examined the broader context of prohibition enforcement and its effects on communities that rejected its legitimacy. The law had been imposed on populations that had been making whiskey for centuries, had criminalized behavior that generations had considered entirely natural, had created conflicts between federal authority and local tradition that produced violence throughout the region. Granny's campaign was extreme, but it represented the far end of a spectrum of resistance that had made the law unenforceable. The songs that emerged from the Granny Combs legend were among the most powerful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured the fury of an old woman who had killed 21 federal agents in revenge for what they did to her grandson. The first verse described Granny and Homer, the old woman and the boy who was the last of her blood, the life they had built in a hollow that the government would not leave alone. The melody was warm and tender, suggesting love that should have been protected. The second verse described the raid, the agents with badges and warrants, the boy dragged from his grandmother's arms. The melody turned dark, the notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear. The third verse described the cage, the beatings, the 9 months of torture inflicted on a child. The melody became something terrible here, something that made listeners uncomfortable in ways they could not fully explain. The fourth verse described the broken boy who returned, the silent creature who had replaced the laughing child, the damage that no amount of love could repair. The melody was grief itself, sorrow made audible. The fifth verse described the campaign of vengeance, the 21 agents who fell one by one over 2 years, the grandmother whose love had become fury. The melody became relentless, inevitable, unstoppable. The sixth verse described Crawford's end, the week of suffering that Granny imposed, the cage she built that mirrored what had been built for Homer. The melody achieved a terrible symmetry, justice rendered in matching pain. The final verse described the aftermath, the grandmother who lived another 15 years caring for her broken grandson, the truth that emerged only after death. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, though a peace that carried the weight of everything that had happened. Musicians who performed this ballad reported that audiences responded with intensity that exceeded other songs in the tradition. The listeners understood something that transcended simple approval or condemnation, something that recognized both the horror of what Granny had done and the horror that had been done to Homer first. The historians who have studied the Combs case have reached varying conclusions about its significance. Some have analyzed it as the most extreme example of resistance to prohibition, evidence that government overreach could produce consequences that no law enforcement agency was prepared to handle. Granny Combs had waged what amounted to a one-woman war against the federal government and had won, had killed 21 of its agents without ever being caught or punished. Others have focused on the specific circumstances that made Granny's campaign possible. The mountain network that provided information and assistance, the skills that a lifetime of self-sufficient living had developed, the patience and determination that allowed her to sustain a killing campaign for 2 years without making mistakes that would have led to her capture. Her success was not merely the result of individual capability, but reflected the strengths of a culture that the federal government had fundamentally misunderstood. The psychological analysis has examined both Granny's capacity for violence and the trauma that Homer experienced. The abuse inflicted on a 9-year-old boy, the deliberate destruction of his childhood, represented a failure of governmental responsibility that went far beyond any individual agent's cruelty. The system that was supposed to rehabilitate juvenile offenders had instead broken a child who had done nothing except help his elderly grandmother. The legal analysis has examined the implications of the case for government overreach and the limits of enforcement authority. Prohibition had been unpopular from the beginning, and aggressive enforcement in communities that rejected the law's legitimacy had created enemies whose determination exceeded anything the Bureau was prepared to handle. Granny Combs represented the extreme end of a spectrum of resistance that had made prohibition unenforceable long before it was repealed. You see, what Granny Combs did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. She killed 21 men over 2 years, used methods designed to cause maximum suffering, conducted a campaign that no law could sanction regardless of provocation. The fact that her grandson had been terribly abused does not eliminate the fact that she took 21 lives in response. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that killing is wrong. Her great-grandson had been caged like an animal, beaten when he cried, broken so thoroughly that he never fully recovered. The legal system had provided no remedy, the government had accepted no responsibility. The men who had destroyed a child had faced no consequences until Granny provided them. The graves where Granny and Homer eventually rest side by side are still maintained by descendants who return to the Combs property for annual gatherings. The property itself has been preserved, the cabin where Granny lived still standing, the hollow where the raid occurred still bearing witness to what happened there. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at Granny's grave, to read the simple inscription that marks her resting place? Would you walk through the hollow where federal agents came to enforce a law that the mountain people had never accepted? Would you try to understand how a grandmother's love could transform into violence so extreme? The journey to Letcher County is easier now than it was in 1929, the roads paved and the world more connected than it was when Granny Combs began her campaign. But the mountains remain ancient and patient, holding their memories close. The graves of grandmothers and grandsons rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of Appalachia's deadliest granny, of Delilah Combs, who killed 21 federal agents after they caged her grandson like an animal. A story of love transformed into fury, of patience that lasted 2 years, of mountain justice that the federal government could not prevent or punish. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. A 71-year-old grandmother declared war on the United States government because they put her 9-year-old great-grandson in a cage, and she won that war by killing every man who had participated in his suffering. The federal government never caught her, never punished her, never even identified her as a suspect until decades after her death. What about you? If someone you loved was caged and beaten and broken by those who claim to represent the law, what would you do? Could you do what Granny did? Would you? Was Delilah Combs a monster, or was she something else entirely? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. Thanks for listening to this story, and as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains because the mountains never forget,